Le floor est yours.
Merci Caroline, merci à tous et merci aussi pour l'opportunité d'être ici et de plus de parler en anglais. Isabelle wanted me to talk about the study of material culture and the Bard Graduate Center. And I thought that what I would do would be, first of all, to do what I'm told, and second, to try and make it a historical treatment. So the title in English, How to Make a Field by Making an Institute, or Academic Administration as a Form of Scholarship. And in a way, this is a how-to lecture, like one of those videos on YouTube where you learn how to fix your plumbing. But it is also, in a certain way, an example of a genre that I once wrote a short essay in called The Intellectual History of Academic Administration. I was the administrator at the Bard Graduate Center for 17 years. I'm leaving that position and the institution at the end of the month of June to take over the American Academy in Rome as its president. So this actually ends up being an interesting opportunity for me to look back and thematize the work that I have done. So just as Droysen explains that while history unfolds forward, the writing of history is written backwards, because we know the end point from which we can begin. So looking back to 2006 or so, when I started, and this is the how-to part. If you wanted to start an institute of your own, let's say tomorrow or in 25 years, the most important thing is to define the problem. And by which I mean to start with a question. So Caroline, in her introduction, used the word discipline, and I had especially not used the word discipline in my English title, because disciplines we inherit from the past. They are bound by tradition. They are, if not carved in stone on the walls of buildings, they come with very long bibliographies and historiographies. And most of all, they are linked to specific sets of skills or techniques. It's possible, of course, to have new techniques, and in the field of digital humanities, many of them are being developed and will, I am sure, over the next decades be integrated into the existing disciplines. But I would not say that digital humanities is likely ever to be a discipline of its own. It's possible, but more likely to be integrated into existing disciplines. However, just to give you an example, it was the example that started me in this direction. When A.B. Warburg set up his institute in Hamburg, starting around 1905, the core of it was the library, which he described as a Problembibliothek, a library devoted to a problem. And of course, as we know, his problem was the Nachleben der Antike. And he wasn't doing art history. He wasn't doing history of religion. He wasn't doing anthropology. He wasn't doing philosophy. He wasn't doing history, though all of those disciplines were drawn upon, both by him and by the library. He was pursuing a problem, pursuing a question. So I would say, if you want to start an institute, have a good question. So the Bard Graduate Center was founded in 1993, and it had an inchoate question. What got it started was more a feeling of loss or absence, namely, how could one study the history of furniture or ceramics or metal or glass, subjects that were more connoisseurial, were more curatorial, they were museum subjects, they were collecting subjects, they were at the time not academic subjects. So there's a gap, let us create an academic institution to fill that gap. In a way, you could say that was very much thinking like a discipline. Discipline of art history needs to be broader. Of course, there were already, among our historians, very vivid debates about what visual culture was, Bildwissenschaft, trying to push open more what the boundaries of art history could be. So in that sense, the founding of the Bard Graduate Center was a disciplinary move. It had begun with art historians who worked on these sub-academic topics. It had brought in curators to teach. By the time I arrived, more accidentally, by which I mean not with a plan so much as opportunity, a historian of design history had been brought on board and a historian of material culture. But the institution still conceived of itself as doing decorative arts, and its problem, so to speak, was still about broadening an existing discipline. For me, as a historian joining that group and seeing the attempt to broaden the discipline through these different lenses of material culture, design history, and decorative arts, it struck me that the strength of the institution lay elsewhere. So in the first publication of the institution, it was the bulletin of year one, the justification for the institution focused on the universal role of decoration or ornament, found in all times, in all places. And with that to go on, my question was a different question. My question was not how to broaden art history, but how can we study the past through things? And I saw this really in a kind of reference to Warburg's question. How to study the past through things? Well, it was clear that there was no one way to study the past through things. Each discipline, each subfield within a discipline offered a different angle, a different perspective on studying the past through things. Each brought a different set of expectations, different tools, techniques, as it were, different bibliographies, different points of reference. So that really was the starting point, the shifting of the question to this narrower on the one hand, but at the same time potentially much broader, because the past that could be studied through things ranges from the Paleolithic all the way to the present and everywhere. Now, the second thing of importance was that I, as the dean, was also a historian of scholarship, and so I immediately came to this problem of making a field through the knowledge that I had of prior efforts by individuals and groups to study the past through things. I had worked for a long time on the history of antiquarianism, and Arnaldo Momigliano had been very clear that the decay products, so to speak, of early modern antiquarianism in the 19th century included the modern disciplines of anthropology, archaeology, sociology, history of religion, and art history. And I had done a conference and a book about this before I had become dean. So I was aware that there was a much longer prehistory. I was also aware that there was a more recent history and with it an opportunity. So, and both conveniently occurred in the autumn of 1929. So that was the year that the Annales started publishing, and with it, the first real professional focus among academic historians on the material and social world. I mean, they talked about it in terms of economic history, but really what they were doing was making material history as important as political or intellectual history. But if you look at the early numbers of the Annales, there was a pointed exclusion of intellectual and cultural history. At the same time, Warburg dies in October of 1929. And with his passing, the Institute eventually has to relocate to London in 1933, passes from his very rich multidisciplinary approach to one that is much more narrowly practiced through forms of intellectual and cultural history. So a lot of the broader material interest that he had, as well as his interest in topics like religion, moved to the margins. And so sitting in New York in 2006, it appeared that the gap that opened up in 1929 between where essentially material history and intellectual history turned their backs on each other, and these two very powerful and maybe the most important schools of history to have developed in the 20th century moved apart from each other as if turning their backs on each other and walking in opposite directions. And there was a space in between for a cultural historical approach to the material world to take shape. And that was where I thought the Bard Graduate Center should go. So flipping back to the how-to aspect of this talk, the next thing I did was, well, if I really want to make, if that's the context and I want to make a research institute, I should look into the history of research institutes. And of course, there's not much written on the history of research institutes. But fortunately, there is one book that has its own history about it. It was published in 1930 in Hamburg in 2 volumes. Its title is very simply Forschungsinstitute, Research Institutes, Their History, Organization, and Goals. In 2 volumes, the first volume was a history of research institutes from antiquity to the present. Obviously, if we're including Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum in Athens, it's a broader notion of institute than we might have today. And it spilled over into a still more general account of what research itself looked like. That was the first volume, maybe volume and a half. And the second part of the book was a survey of existing research institutes around the world, with a focus on Germany, of course, but also in other countries. Not comprehensive, but it included reports from directors of institutes. So for instance, Fritz Sachsel, who by 1930 had taken over from Warburg, wrote the report describing the goals of the Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliothek Warburg in Hamburg. And for example, Friedrich Pollack wrote the report on the practices of the Institut für Sozialforschung from Frankfurt. So I plunged into that book, which was fascinating reading, and followed a lot of what I had begun thinking about in terms of the work of Peresque and his friends in the 17th century. And then I looked into the history of the école pratique here in Paris and the way in which you could build an advanced institute not around a problem like Warburg's, but around individual researchers in discrete, discontinuous subject areas. Because one of the things that was immediately clear to me when thinking about doing history through things is that it was an enormous subject, that no one, forget about one person, no one group of people could comprehensively cover. So there had to be a logic that could be articulated to others of why an institute, at that point there were 7 or 8 faculty, now there are 16, so it's gotten much bigger, but still there's no way to embrace all of human history in a single institution. So the école pratique was an example of how one could think about an organizational structure that could be exemplary without at the same time being comprehensive. So that, in some sense, was where a lot of my drawing on the history that I knew of, history of scholarship, for the articulation of the project came from. Another example, which also came through very clearly, was from work I had done on the relationship between Fernand Braudel and S.D. Goitein in the 1950s. This was basically a project that failed, which was interesting in itself, but it was a project to really use the information from the Cairo Geniza to organize a material history, economic history of the Mediterranean in the 11th and 12th centuries. And since Goitein had just begun doing work on the Indian Ocean in the 12th century and the connection between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean worlds, a project he called From Spain to India, when Braudel learned of this, he immediately tried to bring Goitein into the circle that he was, circle of scholars and researchers he was building in the 6e section at the time. And in fact, as I discovered, he even subsidized Goitein's research for a number of years. But for the purposes of being the dean, that was less interesting. What was more interesting was the work of Braudel's friend, Clémence Heller, who was an American-trained economist, though Viennese Jew who had to flee, came back to Europe after the Second World War, became Braudel's fixer. And he managed the diplomacy for Braudel in a fantastic way, and offered an example of how within an institutional structure it was possible for a kind of informal administrative structure to work as well. So those were examples of the history of scholarship running through the administration. But then to turn to some of the more how-to elements, if you wanted to create an institute of this sort. So one of the very rapid ways that one can do this is by organizing research events. It's a lot easier to invite scholars to come and give a talk than it is, it's a lot easier to invite and bring excellent scholars to one's institute to give talks than it is to offer places of admission to excellent students and get them to come to your institute, because there are many places where students are used to applying, and for a new institution to break into that circle of esteemed, valued, highly praised institutions it's very difficult. Hundreds of years of tradition and alumni offer an almost insurmountable hurdle to a new institution. However, if you have a good idea and you ask interesting questions, it's much easier to gain the attention of scholars who are themselves usually interested in interesting new ideas. And so we organized lots of events. We began slowly and then had a very elaborate events program, one part of which took advantage of our very small size. So I haven't said anything about the Institute. We didn't get Frank Gehry or any famous architect to build a very big building. They're essentially two relatively small townhouses on a residential street on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. A nice location, to be sure, but not necessarily an obvious one for an academic institution. A little bit like Warburg's own KBW in Hamburg, which you can still visit. It's operational and part of the University of Hamburg today, which was itself also just a small private residence on a quiet residential street in Hamburg. But the advantage of being a small independent institution was evident once we started to organize meetings. So whenever we would have a question or a problem, what to do intellectually, we would turn it into an event itself and invite people to come and comment. And it quickly became evident that we could invite people from very prestigious institutions who would be perfectly comfortable coming and talking freely in a way that we realized they might not be in their own institution, because a little bit like Switzerland, mutatis mutandis, we were not big enough to threaten anybody's ego. And so it became a kind of neutral space where people from different institutions or different disciplines got used to coming to having open, free conversations about difficult problems sometimes so difficult that they wouldn't get discussed in their own institutions. Also, I mean, the next thing we did was the slower practice of building up the faculty through a number of appointments. The first position that we made, new position, I'm pretty sure it was the first, was in Islamic art and material culture. And the reason why we chose this, and previously, I guess I would say, previously all of the faculty were either doing European subjects, American subjects, and there was one scholar who had come a few years before I did who worked on Chinese decorative arts. His own focus was the Middle Ages, but he was very broad and covered lots of territory. So I thought that for the nature of our problem and to do it with integrity, we really needed to have representation of the entire world. And I'll say that we never got there. It was something that I still regret that we didn't manage to make more appointments, but I'll come back to that perhaps later. The reason we started with Islamic art and material culture was not accidental. It's precisely because in the tradition of Islamic art, there is no hierarchy between fine art and decorative art. There is none of the relationship to painting and sculpture that we know of from European tradition and which shaped the historiography and ultimately the disciplinary shape of instruction. And so as part of our own argument institutionally, and as a way of getting out from underneath, instead of simply saying, as people in my institution did, though I found it always a somewhat tendentious argument, instead of saying, oh, it's not that our arts are minor arts, our arts are fine arts also. But even to say that just accepts the hierarchy while demanding to be included in it. I much preferred rather subverting the whole idea of a hierarchy, for which Islamic art was a perfect field in which to move. So that's an example, in a way, of thinking not just about appointments to fill, but also that the choice of the field in which to make an appointment is a way of making an institutional argument. The next field we developed was in museum anthropology. So not so much going into the field, though the person we hired had a lot of experience with field work, but somebody who could work through existing collections. And that was useful because it enabled us to cross different borders, for instance, between history of collecting, anthropology, history of art, history, institutional history. All of those are at play when we look at anthropology in the museum. And again, the logic for doing this was practical as well. Our institute's buildings were a 5-minute walk away from the American Museum of Natural History, which has within it the anthropology division, which, were it independent, would be one of the 2 or 3 largest anthropology museums in the United States, for sure, and which I knew from many years of walking my children when they were little through their exhibitions, that they were dramatically underfunded compared to other parts of the museum. The scientists got all the money, the anthropologists got 0, and they were quite embarrassed about the state of their collections. So I proposed that we fund a postdoctoral fellow who would come and spend half their time working in the museum's ethnographic collections, half the time teaching at Bard, and would do an exhibition drawing on the collections of the museum, since the museum had no way to show the enormous number of objects in their collections. So we started with a postdoc, and then eventually we turned the person who had the first one into a full-time faculty member, and then continued the postdoctoral fellowship. And so we went through, we did items from their Northwest Coast collections. We did another project on archaeological textiles from South America. We did a project that was about an expedition the museum sent to Burma in 1935. We did another one of these postdocs and books and exhibitions on materials from Oceania. We did another one on textiles that had been collected in Bali by Margaret Mead early in her career. And we did, there's one more that I can't remember. Yes, we did one on native textiles of the American Southwest, so Navajo textiles. And that project is actually up in the gallery now and online as well. And this postdoc enabled us to do something else, which was to create a focal point to bring together teaching, research, and exhibitions. So in thinking about what would make the institution unique and competitive with other much larger, better endowed institutions, some idea of curricular innovation seemed essential. And the institution had been founded with an exhibition gallery where it put together, and still does, very elaborate exhibitions that attract many people and which are a form of advertising for not just the institution, but the subject matter as well. But with the postdoc at the Natural History Museum, we created a different model where we tried to envision the exhibition as a very direct piece of research that would be taught by the professor to students in the classroom. The students would be contributing to the exhibition, and the whole project would be modeled more on the journal article than on the monograph. So it was not meant to be comprehensive treatment of a subject, but rather a chance for the faculty member, functioning as curator, to do a piece of research, but to do the research and output it, to use a bad word, as an exhibition. This was important not only for the institutional mission, since we had an exhibition gallery, but also because many of our students, in fact, the vast majority of our students, go on to careers in museums as curators. So what we really wanted was for them to be bilingual, so to speak, able to speak the language of academics with professors and the language of museum practices with curators. But then we realized that for them to be bilingual in this way, our faculty members had to be bilingual as well. And since, many of them had lots of experience working with objects, some in museums as well, but they had chosen to be professors. And so this project was in part also about getting our faculty to be able to think like curators from time to time as well, in order to teach our students to be able to do that also. I'm going to move a little bit more quickly now. There's still a few more appointments I want to talk about just because they raise important questions. We created a digital media lab at a certain point when we expanded our physical footprint, because we realized that the world of three-dimensional objects was especially ill-served by two-dimensional photography or slides. And so the new technologies, new even in 2009, were already better for the work that we were doing. And the Digital Media Lab, in turn, has served as a focus for students to do work not only in their own research, and several have gotten jobs in museums as directors of digital things, but also to help produce projects for exhibitions. We created a position for the material culture of New York City because we thought, well, here we are. And one night when I was trying to think about how we should do this search, I went on Google, as one does, and I looked for material culture of New York City as search terms. And it had in the whole universe of Google at that point only 2 hits, both of which referred to a single session at a conference whose speakers were our graduate students. So at that point, I realized there was an enormous opportunity to be claimed. And so we did this search, and we hired somebody who was not yet working in this field, but we pushed him into this field because we wanted somebody to develop it, and he did a wonderful job. Unfortunately, he died all too young, unexpectedly. And eventually we replaced him with an equally interesting person who is a historical archaeologist who works on New York City in the 19th century, and who, as a graduate student, had worked on a small dig that had been done in Central Park. You may or may not have heard of this. Before there was Central Park, before 1857, really, there were various unorganized, unrecognized villages of people who were living there, one of which, Seneca Village, had a large population of freed African Americans and also first-generation Irish immigrants. And their town, with churches and homes and fields, was seized by the government using the right of eminent domain and buried for the building of Central Park. And for a long time lost to history as well. The revival of interest on this really dates back just 25 years. So it happened that this person we hired to do the material culture of New York City as a graduate student had worked on this excavation, and her teachers had retired, and so she was in line to take over this project and any future excavation that might occur. And what was especially important for us is that this Seneca Village was literally 1 block away from where our institute is. So if there were to be any new work on the subject, we would be well placed to lead it. And I say that just as an example of thinking ahead, if you are creating an institute, to possibilities that are not yet available but which are possible. In the same way, we hired an ancient archaeologist who had worked on an excavation in the Cyclades. So when we hired him, we essentially acquired the possibility of sending our students to his excavation. And so we built a little, we organized a field school for our students to go and do excavation work in Greece as part of their existing travel program. And then as part of a grant, we, on conservation, we brought in a chemist, a material scientist, who worked on objects. And all of a sudden we realized that with these other disciplines, we actually had missed something very important, that talking about the cultural history of the material world was just a metaphor without having a scientist on the faculty. And what was especially interesting is that, it might seem on the surface a bit jarring to add a natural scientist to a collection of humanists. In fact, our students accepted this reality without any question. For them, it seemed perfectly normal. It took us professors a little bit longer to understand why. But it was very clear to me that someone like the person we hired, who works on objects, essentially was a historian just like we were historians. What she did with her instruments was tell us to reconstruct backwards, in some sense, what the life of that object had been, using the history of its material transformation. So our archives on paper, written in languages, hers was the object itself, and it was written in molecules and elements, but she too was interested in what happened to that object over the course of its existence. Now, normally, people like her work with museums or private collectors who are interested in returning the object to its original state. For reasons far too vast, though interesting, for me to go into it now, most of the work of people who are called conservation scientists is hitched to trying to understand the moment of conception of a work of art. Whereas our institute was interested in what happened to that work after it was born. And in fact, it was a perfect fit to have a material scientist with us. Wouldn't have realized it without a grant to encourage us to do that, but it was the right thing to do. I'm running close to time. I want to talk about one more thing, which is we created a journal and a book series, but governance. So it's also important when you create a new institution to try and create appropriate rules. One of the things we did was, as we developed the project that involved teaching and exhibiting and research all together around the fellow from the Museum of Natural History, we also rewrote our faculty handbook, which might seem incredibly tedious But from the point of view of academic administration and intellectual history, it's actually structurally important. If we wanted to get our faculty doing digital projects or doing exhibitions, and at the same time, our rules told our faculty that they would only get promoted or obtain a permanent position if they published single-authored monographs, then there's no way we would get our faculty to do digital projects or curate exhibitions, because digital projects, as you may know, and exhibitions, as you may know, are entirely collaborative. And one of the things we wanted, in fact, to do with our exhibition gallery was to use it as a humanities laboratory to get scholars in the habit of working collaboratively. But it wouldn't happen if, at the same time, we were telling them, oh no, but it's great that you do those things, but we're not going to actually reward you for doing any of those things. So we undertook, in fact, to revise the faculty handbook. And when it came to this, this issue, we didn't want to just say that we would accept an exhibition or a digital project the way we would accept a book, because just like not all books are the same, not every exhibition project or digital project is the same. So instead, we did something else. We did a little project, just like I said we did when we had these kinds of issues. We had a little working group to try and identify what were the excellences, what were the virtues of the single-authored monograph. What did it represent such that it was worthy of being used as a measure of someone's excellence? And so we eventually worked out a kind of typology of the academic monograph. So then, once we had worked out those virtues that we thought worth rewarding, we were able to say that tenure and promotion was going to be linked to those virtues, whether they took the form of a traditional single-authored monograph or a digital project or an exhibition. So, I mean, in a way, that was a crucial step. In the beginning, we had to have these exhibition projects written into the contracts of the fellows, of the postdoctoral fellows, because the faculty weren't going to do them. But once we changed the faculty handbook, we were able to fill up the schedule with faculty doing exhibitions, because though they may have been interested before, the structural conditions were dissuasive. But having changed the structural conditions, now we had actually allowed them to think more creatively about how their intellectual historical work would be presented. So I'm going to stop here because I think time is up. But I hope that I've given some sense of how administration can be a form of intellectual history looking back, but also history, in a sense, put to work. And the development of an institution be itself a kind of research project that intervenes in the present to open up possibilities for the future. Thank you.